All right. Greetings to you, colleagues, youth workers, ministry leaders, pastors, covenanters, and friends. My name is Tim Ciccone, and I'm the Director of Youth Ministry for the Evangelical Covenant Church. And welcome to Embrace webinar number 22. And today we have the great honor of hosting Dr. Preston Sprinkle, discussing his brand new youth ministry curriculum that was authored in joint effort with Project 619, called Christian Sexuality, the Truth About Jesus, Sex, and Gender. As a reminder, Embrace is a suite of human sexuality discipleship resources and experiences, which are curated and created by the Make and Deepen Disciples team of the Evangelical Covenant Church. You can find more information on Embrace by visiting covchurch.org/embrace. Embrace resources are in harmony with the adopted position of the Evangelical Covenant Church, the center of which is faithfulness in heterosexual marriage and celibacy and singleness. The special emphasis of Embrace is to equip our churches to flourish in Christian love for the LGBTQ individuals and communities. Our Embrace webinar series has focused on a wide range of ministry leaders and authors over the years. And at times, we focused on youth, adolescent development, and the teenage journey. Today, I am honored to have a conversation with the one and only Dr. Preston Sprinkle, who is the president of the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. Preston is no stranger to the Covenant Church and has been a blessing to us as a church family for, I think, 2 to 3 years now, if not a little bit more, especially in equipping the church to care well in our local communities. But for those of you who don't know him, a more full bio is available on our Embrace website. But in addition to being a biblical scholar, an international speaker, and a best-selling author, my guess is Preston enjoys being known more as a husband to his wife, Chris, and the father of their 4 children. Preston, it is wonderful to have you with us today. Thank you for being here.
It's great to be on, Tim. I'm super excited about this important conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just a quick word about today's format for our live audience. Again, thank you for being with us. And what we're going to do today is I'm going to be asking Preston a number of different questions that he and I have worked on together. And I think you'll find the content that he delivers very important to our conversations, particularly as we work with teenagers in our churches. But we want to invite you, our live audience, to also submit questions via the chat function. We'll have a time later in the webinar for Preston to respond to these, really as many questions as we can get to. So with that in mind, let's get started. So Preston, in just a moment, I'm going to give just a brief overview of the curriculum so our audience can kind of get an idea of what you have created. But first, can you tell us why has this topic been so important to you, and what was the catalyst for creating the curriculum?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question to lead with. So for those who don't know, my work and ministry, like what wakes me up in the morning, is I want to help Christian leaders to engage questions about faith, sexuality, and gender with theological faithfulness and courageous love. And my primary job is to resource the church, especially leaders, with resources that can help them navigate this volatile conversation, maybe better than we have done in the past. Now, the focus of my attention has been on primarily church leaders, like pastors and elders and even like campus leaders and so on. But over the years, we've gotten a lot of questions about, well, how can, like, we need to disciple our youth, or maybe, senior leaders are saying we need to help our youth leaders to disciple the youth. And that is almost like cross-cultural ministry when it comes to this conversation. Things are extremely different in how we go about this conversation in terms of, how we used to go about it 20 years ago, or how people my age, I'm 45, think through it, and how younger people are thinking through it. So we've known that this is a massive need for us to produce something that is not just biblically faithful. Like, should go without saying, like, obviously I'm going to attempt to create something that's biblically faithful, but how can you present the Christian sexual ethic in a way that's not just biblically faithful, not just true to scripture, isn't just clear, but is actually compelling, more compelling than the competing voices that our youth are hearing every minute of every day. You know, I mean, we are being bombarded, especially our youth, are being bombarded with messages about what it means to flourish as a sexual human being. How can we present the Creator's design for our sexuality in a way that is not just true to Scripture, but is going to be a compelling alternative to the many voices they are hearing? So that was the motivation for creating this project.
I appreciate that. Well, let me share my screen here, and hopefully everyone can see that. And let me just talk a little bit about, give an overview of the curriculum. So I'm taking this directly from the curriculum. The mission of this resource is to faithfully present the Creator's design for our bodies and to help Christian youth and young adults follow Jesus with their sexuality. The vision is to see a generation, I love that, embrace a holistic and Christ-centered view of sex, sexuality, and gender. This series is a powerful catalyst for healthy and meaningful conversations about sex, sexuality, and gender. And so what I'm showing here is one of the guides that comes right from the curriculum. And there's actually 4 modules that include 12 sessions, plus a number of different coaching sort of sessions as well. There's a getting started session, a parent night in a box session. And then you start really the teaching with, you set things up with God's love story. You discuss the authority of God in Scripture. You discuss shame and forgiveness, sex and marriage, singleness and intimacy, porn and masturbation, same-sex sexuality, transgender identities, LGBTQ plus questions, dating and friendships, sex in the I world, and following Jesus in a sexualized age. Now, what I love about this is that every one of these modules, and probably it would be more fair to say every one of the sessions comes with some sort of mentor video, a youth video, a leader's guide, a leader email, a parent guide, a parent email, slides like for PowerPoint. There's a devotional that comes with a lot of things. And there's a number of these modules that have supplemental material. So you've really thought through every angle on the ways that you can coach people. And I'm just scrolling through this so people can get an idea that you're really trying to coach youth workers well in setting the right tone for this context. So thank you for this. And I hope this was not a little bit too much, but I wanted to share at least a bit of an overview for people to really understand what we're working on. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into some of these topics.
Yeah. So when we originally had the idea, we wanted to, the kind of heart of the project was to create a series of videos that a youth leader can show to the actual youth. And then that is the backbone of the project. There's 12, 20-minute-ish videos that we kind of envision a youth leader on a Wednesday night, Sunday morning, whenever your main meeting is, that you can play the video for 20 minutes. It's not overly long, but it's thorough enough to spark some good, interest. And then there's a question at the end that we would imagine a youth group kind of breaking up into more small groups, tables or whatever, where they can discuss a question that's linked to the video. Now that's the backbone of the project. But then when we gathered a bunch of youth leaders around us in the early stages of the project, and I guess that's important for me to note that this whole project, we walked with lots of different youth leaders from multi-ethnic backgrounds, from urbans, from cities all around the country, youth kind of gurus that have a more broad perspective on youth ministry as a whole. And we wanted to make sure that we were producing a resource that actual youth leaders, that were meeting the needs of actual youth leaders. And one thing they said is, Preston, look, these videos can be great. We assume you're going to produce a good project, but at the end of the day, it's going to be the leaders that are walking in the lives of these students day to day that's going to make the biggest difference. How do we train them? Because some of our leaders might be 21-year-old college students, no offense, 21-year-old college students, but they may say, I don't know how to walk through these topics with the students. So we created another series of 12 mentor videos. Wow. Where me and the co-creator are speaking directly to youth leaders and volunteers or anybody that's involved in discipling youth to help them carry on the ongoing conversation with these students. But then we realized they're like, well, we're not just discipling youth, we're discipling their parents as well. We're helping parents to come alongside their youth. So then we created a whole nother curriculum. It's not different. It's just a more parent-centered curriculum. So where a parent can disciple their youth, even if they're not in a youth program. And with the youth version of this, we also have material for parents. As you know, you have to keep parents in the know with what you're teaching if you're going to address this topic, because half the parents might flip out. They're going to have tons of questions. So we want to help you disciple parents as you're discipling their kids. So we wanted this to be a holistic, comprehensive discipleship experience. And there's lots of other material that come along with it, but we wanted to just hand the youth leader the A to Z resources so that you can use this to disciple your students.
So really, there's a wide range of uses. What I hear you saying is you could actually, if I was a pastor or youth pastor in a church, I could, advertise this to our parents and say, parents, you could purchase this material, use it in your own homes as a discussion guide for your families. A youth worker could purchase it and show the videos. And actually, maybe you could talk a little bit about that. How do you see tangibly the curriculum getting used in churches, and how would you suggest that a youth worker would best organize and set the series up for success? Would this be, is it an appropriate time of year that they would want to engage in the series, or, stuff like that?
Well, one of the challenges we had was, this is obviously such a complex topic, so many questions. You mentioned this, and now you raised 5 other questions about this. You mentioned transgender identities, and what about this? You mentioned so we wanted to, but we didn't want to make it a 52-week course.
Right.
12 weeks is as short as we can make it. But even that, I'm very, very well aware that even that's like, dude, we never do like 12-week, courses. So that's why we divided it into terms of the modules. Theoretically, you could do the first 3 in the first first 3 weeks, take a break, do something else, do the next 3. Ideally, it would be good to do 12 weeks in a row, because there is a lot of continuity that builds. But you could do the first 2 modules together, take a break, do another 2 modules. But 12 weeks, we kind of thought like you could do it in the fall or the spring. I wouldn't recommend summer. A lot of people are gone. And if people miss too many of the episodes, like if they just watched, if they were there for week 1, then 4, then 5, then 9, and they're going to have a lot more questions that may have been addressed. So I would say best case scenario, do 12 weeks in a row. If you can't do that, maybe do 2 modules together than the other 2. And there's, we're very well aware of the need to include parents in the conversation. So we have this whole thing called Parent Night in a Box, where you can have a meeting, invite parents. I would say 3 or 4 weeks before you even start the series, so that you can explain what the series is about. You can answer questions they might have, what is theological, or what's my son or daughter going to hear, or my son's gay, how's he going to feel, going through the series. So we even have another video too you can send to parents. We have a video you can send to senior leaders, because you might get excited about this, but like, oh, my senior pastor's not going to go for this. We even have a video where I and my co-creator are speaking directly to the senior leaders on the need why their youth ministry needs to go through this. So we really did try to exhaust all of the possible hurdles that you might face, so that you can go through this material, with the support of your church and the families.
Yeah, I love that. And I appreciate your sensitivity to that. We have a number of churches where the senior pastor and the youth pastor, or whomever is working with teenagers, they might have a different philosophical, even biblical understanding of the way to handle some of these different dynamics. And we've always tried to coach our youth workers to lead up well, communicate with your pastor what you're going to talk about, and what the content's going to look like, and where we're going to land as leaders in our teaching, because it can be very complex. If you don't have the support of your senior pastor, it can be really damaging to the leadership model of the church and the effectiveness of the teaching. So I really appreciate your thoughtfulness around those conversations. Communicating with families, very important. And so that's all really, really good.
One thing to add real quick before I totally forgot to mention this, that if you get the youth version of the curriculum, that comes with up to 50 codes that you can send to the parents. So they can actually, during the week, whatever, they can actually watch the very videos that their youth are going to be watching. Again, we never want this to feel like, hey, we're going to have this conversation and you're not going to know what we're talking about. We have full disclosure. We encourage parents to go through the whole material.
That might be a good time to also mention that you have generously provided the ECC with a discount code, and we will be sending that out in the follow-up email to this webinar, but it's ECC 10 just as a reference point. And again, that will be in the email that we send out after the webinar is over. I want to shift to a little bit more of a philosophical level, Preston. And so let's just kind of get into a heavy topic for a minute. Over the last year, well, I guess it's all heavy, but over the last year and maybe even years, we've seen the emergence of a narrative around pain, particularly in the conversation around the damage that what's known as purity culture, the purity culture movement in youth ministry in the 90s, early 2000s, maybe even before that, was created. There's pain around that movement. And so I'd like you to address what purity culture is from your perspective. I could give a definition, but I think our audiences would like to hear from you more than me. And the question is, how do you respond to this? And how does your curriculum differ from some of the movements and curriculums that were created back in the 90s and the 2000s?
That's a great question. And I'm going to address it assuming that maybe our audience doesn't know what purity culture is. So
Sure.
I might be a little basic. Back in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, there was a movement now referred to as kind of purity culture, purity movement, that one of the goals was a really good one. That we want to encourage, especially young people, to remain sexually pure before marriage. Okay, so I mean that's one common value that we share with the purity culture. Like, we do think that sex belongs within marriage. Some of the fallout, though, is from the purity culture. There's several things that I think were unhelpful in the purity movement. Some of it was unstated, just kind of implied. Some of it was very much stated. A big one was there was this kind of assumed promise of marriage within the purity culture. So, and I grew up right in the purity culture. And it's kind of like, man, if you save yourself until marriage, don't have sex, and try not to go past first base with your girlfriend, and if you do all these things and remain pure, then God will bless you with a spouse. You'll have great marital sex within marriage will be so much better if you save yourself. And that's just, there's nowhere in the Bible that promises marriage. And so you had some fallout, where people saved themselves till marriage. They didn't have sex, but then they didn't get married. Or 25, 30, 35 years old, they're still not married. And like, God, I kept my half of the bargain. Where are you keeping your half of the bargain? Or, especially this happened for women, they get married, and statistically, like a third of women say sex is painful, especially the first time. Sometimes there's lots of shame that surrounds it, and sometimes that shame was caused by messages in the purity culture. So they do get married, and all of a sudden sex is like not enjoyable. Or maybe their husband turns out to be a jerk a couple years later, or maybe their husband, partly because of the purity culture, just uses their wife as an outlet for sexual release. And so that became a big kind of problem, this kind of transactional nature. I will be pure, and then God will bless me in reward for my behavior. Another thing that came from the purity culture is a lot of shame surrounding either people that messed up. They had sex outside of marriage, and they were told now they're damaged goods, they can never go back, which, yes, in a sense, like, that is a significant thing that people do. And it's not like you just wake up the next day and all is well. Like, sex is a powerful act, but you had a lot of, especially women, that had just ongoing shame surrounding them, that they have messed up and that's done for life. There's like almost no forgiveness, no whatever. And then they go into a marriage and they carry that shame with them, and that causes problems. And so our curriculum is very well aware of how can we advocate for what the Bible says is a good thing, we use the phrase to embody sexual integrity, to steward ourselves in a way that's faithful towards Christ, sexually speaking, but be aware of some of these missteps. And one of the big ones too, has to do with sexual abuse within the purity culture. I don't know if it addressed this very well. Again, if there are some things out there that did address it well, then hats off to them. But you had a lot of women. I mean, 1/3 of every female, 1/4 of every male has been sexually abused, typically by a family member or another person in the congregation. And obviously that's not their fault, but a lot of people that went through an abusive situation were viewed as, now I'm damaged goods because somebody stole this decision away from me. And so they were kind of reading their abuse through the lens of, I messed up, I had sex outside of marriage, and that wasn't really addressed well. So all that to say, this is the one reason why our third video in the series deals directly with shame and forgiveness. We don't even get into the topic of sex directly until video 4. That's very intentional, because we need to hear about God's love for us and our response to his love. Like, that's fundamental for all ethics, especially sexual ethics. Then we need to hear about God's authority. Like, it doesn't make any difference talking about what the Bible says about sex, sexuality, and gender if the student isn't convinced that the Bible should be the authoritative guide. And then before we even get into sex and marriage, we talk about shame and forgiveness, because if 1/3 of your youth went through an abusive situation, most of them probably have never talked about it. When you start talking about sex and marriage, they have these thick lenses through which they're even reading that through or hearing that, because they've been through an abusive situation. So we need to kind of address that head on before we even talk about sex. So we actually have one of our co-hosts, Monica Zuniga, who was raped when she was, I think, 19, and she has really went through a lot of just trauma from that, obviously, but has ended up really coming to a healthy place and is healed from that. And so she tells her story, and yeah, it's so powerful. It brings tears to my eyes whenever I hear it. And so we address the hard topics, especially, and we do it in an order that we think will be most effective for helping youth understand God's design for sexuality.
Well, I really appreciate that. And I think our audience also really appreciates that. I think there's also so much to be done by the church to unpack some of the pain from those decades that you mentioned. And I think even teaching these topics in a healthy way, in a way that doesn't put the onus on shame, is a part of that solution, right? So I really appreciate your disposition on this. Thank you. Yeah. And on behalf of the church, thank you. I want to shift now into a little bit more specifics on the actual sessions and the topics that you cover. And you've said a little bit already about the first 3 that I've got listed in my notes. So I just want to make sure if there's anything left unsaid about these 3 that maybe you want to comment on them, and then we'll talk about some of the others. But, you know, I want to, so the kind of game here is I want to name the topic, and if you can give us just a minute or so on the big idea of each one. So you already talked about the authority session. You already kind of mentioned sex and marriage session, and then the shame session. Is there anything else you'd like to say about those 3? I recognize we're not doing it justice, but I also don't want to give the whole thing away, right? So buy the curriculum and use it. But what would you say? Anything else about those 3 sessions before I name some of the others?
I don't think there's a whole lot to say. I mean, I will say this, and I might say it again, but you know, we talk very openly and frankly about stuff, and we want to let people in our parent video, we tell them up front that we're not trying to be edgy, we're not trying to diminish the conversation, but at the same time, there's no benefit in kind of dancing around the things that everybody is actually thinking about. So we do talk very explicitly about things, and so and this is where our target age is kind of 13 to 18. Some 13-year-olds, maybe even 14-year-olds, it depends on their environment, how they're raised, you know, that might be a little young. Some 11-year-olds it might be perfect for. Like, it just depends on kind of where they're at. But yeah, sex and marriage, we want to value marriage without idolizing it. That would be a big theme too. And that's why right after sex and marriage, we talk about singleness and intimacy. And we really want to build into students that marriage is a possibility, not a promise. I think one of the most damaging things we can do is to say what God never said, that marriage is a promise. There's not a verse in the Bible that says you will get married. There's nothing in the gospel that says you will get married. Why? Because marriage is a calling, a specific calling for some, not all. Maybe many, but not all. Maybe many people will get married, but singleness, very clear in the scriptures, is an equally valid vocation. And we can live without sex, but we can't live without love and intimacy. And so we want to build in those distinctions that, yes, we need intimacy. Yes, we need deep, you know, love with one another. And that can come whether you're married or single. So while we want to look at the sanctity of something like sex and marriage, we don't want to idolize it either. So you have that theme kind of running through all the topics.
I'm going to ask about a couple more here, but before I do, just to the live audience, if there's any questions that you'd like us to address in a minute, we're going to be shifting to the audience questions. Please feel free to put those in the chat. You have a session dedicated to porn and masturbation. You talk about this, teach on it.
Yeah.
And obviously this is a unbelievable conversation. One Christian author says that pornography is the wallpaper of this generation, Generation Z, right? And it's certainly impacting the way that Gen Z sees their sexuality, the way that they're going to engage in their sexual ethic. How do you talk about this topic, and what are some of the things that youth pastors can expect in that?
Yeah, this is obviously such an important topic, the porn and masturbation one. One thing that we're very well aware of is that Gen Z is very concerned about safety and harm. This comes from secular studies, from Christian studies. You see it in the rhetoric, you know, if it's not harming anybody, then what's wrong with it? Or just almost overly concerned with safety and harm and what's safe and that person's being harmed. And that is the framework, the ethical framework that Gen Z naturally has. And so when we talk about things like porn, we don't just say it's a sinful, here's the verse. We do that. We bring in biblical authority, but we also bring in a lot of like brain science and sociological stuff, you know, at their level, to show that porn is not just morally wrong, it's actually relationally destructive. And it always, as one psychologist says, who we have kind of interviewed, Jay Stringer, says it always ends up harming women and children. Most Gen Z are going to be concerned about something that harms women and children. And statistically, that's the case. But the way it rewires your brain, it leads to dysfunctions and addictions, and it ends up harming you. Like, we do, in a sense, tap into this moral impulse. It's a very good one among Gen Z, and show that sin isn't just morally wrong, but it's harmful. Masturbation's tricky. We make a distinction between porn and masturbation. We say very clearly the Bible doesn't have a verse that says thou shalt not masturbate. And we also have our female hosts talk about masturbation, so we don't make it just a male thing, because that's not true anymore. It's more porn and masturbation. The numbers are higher with males, but they're increasing with females. So we have another story brought in with a female who had an addiction to masturbation at the age of, I think, 10 or something, and how she worked through that. That's another thing to point out. These videos are not, I'm not on the video. I'm on the mentor video, but I'm too old to be on these videos. We have a lot of younger-ish people, not just young, but a wide range of people who are both serving as hosts, but also we have lots of stories brought in. This whole curriculum is very much narrative driven, like it's story driven, not in the place of the Bible, but as a way of embodying what biblical truth looks like. We have tons of stories to do that. So yeah, the masturbation one, we leave it a little bit ambiguous. You know, any kind of addictive or behavior is not healthy. But yeah, we don't think that masturbation is intrinsically sinful. We want to ask deeper questions about what is sex for, and why did God design our bodies this way? We want to get students to ask some of those deeper questions.
Thank you. My producer is telling me to clarify the question. We want you to put the questions in the Q&A button, not the chat button. So thank you, digital producer Ryan, behind the scenes. I apologize for that. Sections 7, 8, and 9 are very important. Obviously, the whole curriculum is very important. But 7, 8, and 9 deal with, you know, what we would talk about as more polarizing topics: same-sex sexuality, transgender identities, which is very complex for youth workers to work with, trying to figure out how to love students where they're at, and then LGBTQ plus questions. So I guess my general question, and you can go whatever direction you want to here, Preston, but how are you addressing these categories? And again, what can youth workers expect if they purchase this curriculum, use this in their context with those three categories, and take as much time as you want on each?
Yeah. So again, we're very sensitive to how Gen Z is thinking through this conversation. We don't come at this as if we're talking to people, you know, Tim and I's age. Right. What works for me, Tim and I, probably won't work for youth. So we're very cognizant of the cultural and age difference here. Same-sex sexuality, we begin by kind of addressing how the church has not loved gay people well. We lead with a lot of relational focus in this. We've got a lot of testimonies from LGBT people. In fact, of the 25 voices that are involved in this project, like that you'll see on the video, I think 7 or 8 would be on the LGBT spectrum on some level. Some of whom you don't really find out till later in the series. Like some guy goes, "Oh, by the way, I'm same-sex attracted," and the youth have been hearing from this guy for a while. So with same-sex sexuality, we have gay and lesbian people talking about how they've navigated this with faithfulness towards Jesus. We have a few trans people on here that tell their stories. The trans conversation, I've been told that was the best of the 12 videos if we can rank them. That typically people walk away, and it's just the way we kind of framed it. There's a cool story that kind of begins and ends that video that will leave you in tears, really. We kind of explode some of the myths that youth are hearing about trans identities. It's very complex. Can you hear a dog barking, by the way?
A little bit. It's all right. It's real life.
My mic
man.
is not supposed to piss. Yeah, sorry about that. I've never heard my dog go that berserk. I think there's probably a deer in my backyard or something.
It's okay. All right.
Sorry about that.
That's fine.
Yeah. So we address. So with same-sex sexuality, we lead a lot with relationships, and then about the last third, we do get into the Bible. We don't go super deep, but we do lay a foundation. We actually have same-sex attracted people sharing why they believe in a historically Christian sexual ethic, which I think is more powerful. It's one thing for me to say that as a straight guy. It's another thing we have like 2 or 3 gay people say, yeah, I looked into the sort of affirming progressive view, and I don't see it, and I want to follow Jesus faithfully. So we let gay people share their stories with the theology. The third one, LGBTQ questions. I made a mistake. I am actually in that video where the questions that we didn't address head on in video 7 and 8, same-sex sexuality and trans identities, we kind of say, okay, what are all the leftover questions people have? There's like 8 questions that I come on and address. And there's some videos mixed in there. So we don't want to overwhelm the student with too much theology, but we do want to give them a firm theological framework that, again, is very story driven. It's not simply quoting the verses or you must believe this. It is, it's framed within a very humanizing story. So yeah, we're really excited about this portion, because this really is kind of unique in these kinds of curriculums, that we would go so deep into LGBT questions and do so in a way that I think is very compassionate, very holistic, but very true to the scriptures.
I appreciate that. This is all just so good. We could spend a lot more time talking about these things, and I want to keep us moving forward. And we've got some really good questions that have come in from the audience. But before we get to those, I have one more question for you, and it's really really, I'd like you to coach us, right? So can you think of a couple coaching tips for the in the trenches youth workers who are desperately trying to do their best to care and disciple their students in this conversation, in this larger narrative, but they're overwhelmed, right, by massive cultural pressure. Maybe they're getting a ton of pressure from their individual church, or just the complicated nature of dealing with teenagers who have a million different messages coming at them in mass media, or even the parent, right, who just needs to be coached around, how do I care for my son or daughter who's wrestling with these things? Maybe he's even come out. Do you have any just tangible coaching tips? I would love to hear that. And then we'll move into our live audience Q&A.
Yeah. And this is super tough. This is not easy. In fact, I should have said this at the beginning. For you youth workers who are listening, I am your fan. Like you guys are so vital to the kingdom of God in this day and age, having the courage to go out and disciple youth in this day and age. I have a glimpse of how difficult and joy-filled and rewarding your ministry is. So I just said it before, and I'll say it again. I think youth leaders should be the highest paid people in church, but that's for another story. Senior leaders, with the parking spots and stuff, don't like it when I say that, but it's like, you go try and do this, like when youth know more about this conversation than you do. And yeah, anyway, so thank you for doing what you do. Coaching tips. First of all, silence is not an option. Silence is not an option. Our youth, I mean, all of us really, but especially our youth, they are being discipled by somebody every day in a view or certain views of what it looks like to carry yourself sexually. And youth, think about this topic every hour, every minute, maybe, you know. So it doesn't make it would be irresponsible for any Christian leader who claims to be trying to disciple other people to stay silent on this topic. I don't know too many youth program or youth contexts where they don't address it, but I would just say, man, address it more often than maybe you think you need to. Before you address it, you do need to educate yourself, as you know, that this conversation is very complex. Like, I don't think it would be lost time if you read, 1 or 2 books a month on this topic, and that would be maybe a conservative estimate. A youth leader who's not really engaging just for themselves, like this broader sex, sexuality, gender, body conversation, when we have to do this. These are some of the most pressing ethical questions facing the church, and our youth are swimming in the deep end of this conversation. Like, we are not serving them well if we don't address it well. I would also encourage you to be clear and to be bold, not a jerk, obviously, but I think our generation was overly bold. Like, my generation, we just yelled and screamed, threw verses at people. And so I've seen some people kind of swing the pendulum almost too far, and it's all about love and grace and care, whatever. And they're almost scared of the Creator's design for sexuality, or they're almost ashamed of it, or they think that that's going to be a turnoff to youth if they even address a Christian version of sexual ethics. And that may have been true 3 or 4 years ago, but things are kind of different even now. Like, things have progressed to where I think I have 4 Gen Z kids. And this is so that in a sense, this is my world too. And clarity is kindness. I think kids these days, and I've talked to a lot of next gen leaders, they're all saying the same thing. Gen Z wants to be challenged. They want meaningfulness in life. They've seen, they may not admit it, but they've seen the bankruptcy of a Hollywood version of sex. They've seen the bankruptcy of social media versions of relationships. They've seen, it's like they keep doing these things, they keep absorbing this, but they know there's a reason why anxiety, depression, suicidality keep spiking. And they're very well aware of this way of living my life is not working, but I don't know how to stop. So I think having a leader to say, I can show you another way. It might be counterintuitive at first, but it's going to be life-giving in the long run. I think students want to hear that bold message, express with a good tone, kindness, obviously, and humility and authenticity. But don't be afraid of God's design. If it's God's design, then it's good for us.
That's really helpful. So just getting into some of the questions then from our audience, can you just say a little bit more about what in the curriculum, particularly about the transgender section and the LGBTQ conversation, what are you teaching? Can you give us, I know you could talk about this for a long time, so maybe I think our audience would like to hear just a little more specific on what is the teaching. What are you saying that the Bible says, and what can youth workers expect from that part?
Yes. So same-sex. Okay. Let me just give you the theological portion, which again is woven in throughout relationships and some of the nuances and stuff. Theologically, we say very clearly that, I have a gay Christian say, God designed marriage to be between a man and a woman, and that all sexual relationships outside that covenant bond are sin. We look at Genesis 2, we look at Matthew 19 to support that. We do look at we look at one of the so-called prohibition passages. We don't lead with that. We want to help them understand that the main question flows from this: what does the Bible say? What does Christianity teach about the intrinsic meaning of marriage? What is marriage for? Is sex difference an intrinsic part of marriage? So that is what we do it very clearly. With trans identities, that one, the main question there is, what is the role of our biological sex in determining human identity? And that's another thing. We want to almost reframe the question. Like, there's so many slogans and stuff that kids pick up on. Love is love, I'm we need to express our authentic self. I mean, these are really meaningless phrases, because they not meaning. I mean, the phrases might lead to a good conversation, but oftentimes when people say them, they're kind of hollow. So we want to help reframe the question and raise the questions that they should be asking. What is the role of our biological sex in determining our human identity? Is it a shell that covers the real you? Is the real you your internal authentic self, and everything else is inauthentic if there's incongruence? We also, with the trans conversation, we address the whole conversation is framed around gender stereotypes, especially with youth, especially with Gen Z. So many alternative gender identities, genderqueer, non-binary, demigirl, and on it goes, are intertwined with gender stereotypes. And we kind of point that out, that we don't need to be stuffed into some box of a gender stereotype. You can be a more masculine female and you're still female. You can be a more feminine guy and you're still a guy. And we have trans people that share their stories about how absorbing these gender stereotypes, often in the church even, kind of exacerbated their gender dysphoria, and kind of led them to doubt whether they were really a man or a woman. And gender dysphoria is more complicated than just gender stereotypes, but
Right.
it is a significant piece that we spend about probably half the video kind of really unpacking that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Here's another interesting question that's come in. And again, I appreciate all of our questions here. So here it is. I'll try to be as clear as I can. How do you respond, Preston, to the critique that celibacy is a gift and calling given to some, but not all? So what if a gay Christian does not believe it is a gift given to them? Is it fair, or is it biblical for us to expect celibacy for all Christians who are gay or lesbian?
Yeah.
I think
So there's there's many different orientations. There's many different sexual desires that people wrestle with. Same-sex attraction is one of many different desires. God has given, I believe, I would say the Bible does seem to teach one sexual ethic for all humans, regardless of what specific desire they're wrestling with. And that is celibacy during singleness. And if you are called into marriage, and I think the Bible defines marriage as a one flesh union between two sexually different persons. Like, I think sex difference is part of what marriage is. So celibacy and singleness, if God is calling you out of, so in a sense, we're all called to singleness. And I think that's kind of Paul's point there. Being called to singleness is not like, oh, I don't have any desire to get married, therefore I must be called. But if I desire to marry this person or that person, then I must not be called to singleness. I don't think that's what Paul's saying. And we actually have a gay person address that very thing in 1 Corinthians 7 there. So yeah, I think all Christians are called to celibacy and singleness until or unless God calls you out of singleness into a male-female marriage. The whole idea, and again, the assumption that, well, that's not fair for same-sex attracted people. I think that comes with a lot of assumptions about whether or not marriage or sexual expression is necessary for human flourishing. And I think that's, in a sense, that's another product of the purity culture, where the purity culture said, you're not really going to flourish. You're not really complete unless you marry the person you desire and are having lots of great sex with the person you desire. That comes from the purity culture, and it kind of comes from secular society. We're trying to deconstruct both of those assumptions because I think they're just flat out unhelpful and untrue. Again, we can live without sex. We can't live without love and intimacy. And love and intimacy is not, it's not reserved only for married people. So it's a great question. We try to deconstruct a lot of the assumptions that even go into that sort of thinking, that if you're gay, something like celibacy isn't going to work, or if you're gay, an opposite sex marriage won't work. Like, these are all just inaccurate assumptions that we're trying to deconstruct.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think this person's asking the question. They went on a little bit longer. Just they're trying to care well for the people in their community who identify as gay or lesbian. So I get
absolutely. Yeah.
Someone's asking if you can talk just a little bit about your perspective, your teaching on what does the Bible say? Where does the Bible say that marriage needs to be between two sexually different people?
Yeah. Yeah. Genesis 2:23-24, and Matthew 19, 4-6. So Genesis 2, and then, well, even like Genesis 1:27, God created the male and female. And then in Genesis 2, we have the male and female coming together in a one flesh union. And in 2:23, it talks about both equality between the sexes, which is hugely important, right? And also differences between the sexes. The man says, she shall be called woman, for she was created from man. So you have this statement about sex difference, and then it says, therefore, man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two, like male and female, shall become one flesh. And that that equality, unity between two different sexes is kind of woven into the fabric of the whole creation account. The whole creation account in Genesis 1 and 2 is all about differences in creation singing together in harmony, if you will, and marriage is one kind of participation in that beautiful equality and difference within creation. And probably the most explicit statement comes in Matthew 19, where Jesus says, have you not read that from the beginning God created the male and female? He's quoting Genesis 1:27 there. And then he says, for this reason, man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh, which is kind of like the flagship verse for what the Bible says about marriage. So that the one flesh union isn't just a union between two consensual humans, but precisely a unity between two sexually different persons. Now, everything I've said right now is just, has been a basic creed in Christianity for 2,000 years. It still is in global Christianity, but for some Western, more European or American or Canadian societies, they have now defined marriage differently as a consensual union between two humans, regardless of sex difference. And that's one possibility. And if that's what I would say, if people have that definition, in a sense, the burden would be on them to square that with Scripture. Global Christianity or Judaism or Islam has not understood the concept of marriage that way, which again, just because it's historically kind of the consensus doesn't mean it's right. Again, I think it is a consensus within Christianity, global Christianity, because it's there in Scripture.
Yeah, that's helpful, Preston. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Here's I believe a mom or parents, I should say, who's saying their 15-year-old daughter has come out as non-binary. Mm-hmm. So she's going through counseling for depression and anxiety. Mm-hmm. She's fallen away from the church, and this parent is saying, I don't know how to begin to help her and have these conversations. You have any recommendations or pastoral care advice, anything like that, and specifically having these kind of conversations with their daughter?
This question comes up almost every day in my ministry. So let me first of all say to the parent, you're not alone. There has been a 5,000% increase, especially among teenagers in the UK coming out as trans or non-binary. In every Western country, there's been a hockey stick spike among teens identifying as trans, and it's raised some concern, not just among Christians. In fact, most Christians aren't even aware of it, but among some very liberal psychologists and things. The biggest question is, man, this seems to be. This is unprecedented, and is medical intervention, hormones and transitioning, is this the best way to treat a 15-year-old who might have absorbed some cultural, influence that's wrapped up in their trans identity? Can I post something in the chat here? This is a video, a talk I literally just gave a few days ago with, should I post it to everybody?
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Where parents, panelists, and attendees.
Yep, I think that's
it. It's of a female who went through this, who detransitioned out of it, and she's got a lot of really helpful things to say about teenagers coming out as trans, non-binary, who are also dealing with mental health issues. This is a huge conversation going on, and especially in the medical field right now. So all that to say, that's a lot of preliminary. At the end, I ask her name's Helena, can you speak directly to parents right now? Speak directly to parents who might have a child going through this. And again, she went through this, so she's not speaking. It's one thing for me to say, here's what you should do. This isn't my story. This was her story. And some of the things she says, and you need to watch the whole thing, but you have to love your child and just focus on that, and don't get into all the arguments and debates. Your child typically won't listen to you if you lead with arguments, correction, this, that. You need to let them know that you unconditionally love them and you are here for them. Ultimately, whatever their identity, identities are slippery and they change, and identities are just that. It's like an identity is just something somebody says about themselves. Like, I wouldn't worry too much about the identity. My only concern, I would want to, if your child is thinking about taking, let's say 15, it wouldn't be puberty blockers, probably cross-sex hormones, possibly surgery down the road. I would want to hold off on that decision. Let's delay that. But you're not going to help them to delay that if you just bombard them with stats and data and so on. We do have an endocrinologist in the videos in the trans section, an endocrinologist talking about just what are the facts, what do high levels of testosterone do to the female body taken at these levels, like long term, and just says, I'm just telling you what, from an endocrinologist perspective, here are the many risks that happen. And I don't think that message is often very popular today. Anyway, I could say a lot more, but yeah, I would encourage you. I think you'll really, this talk that we gave would be helpful.
Yeah. And just a little bit of a follow-up in the similar category of care for Gen Z. Someone asked, a heavy question here that I think is worth, putting out to you and maybe getting your response from. They're asking, do you say anywhere that practicing homosexuality is a sin in the curriculum? I believe they're referring to.
Yes.
And they're wondering, are there dangers of putting that stake in the ground openly, either in simply engaging Gen Z students or potentially turning off a huge segment of students who don't understand the complexity of the topic?
So we do say that. I don't know if we'd say that word for word like that. I think the language we use is God's design for human flourishing is celibacy and singleness, sex within a male-female marriage. So we try to avoid some phrases that have a lot of baggage to it. So we want to communicate God's truth in a way that's not going to be heard in a wrong way. And we want to frame sexual ethics in the larger grand story of God's love for humanity and the greater Christian narrative. And that's where the purity culture went wrong. I think they kind of talked about sexual ethics in a way that was kind of disconnected with Genesis through Revelation. So we don't want to do that. And we also want to do so in a way that is packaged within this love for humanity. The ultimate question isn't, is it a turnoff to say sex outside of marriage is a sin, male-female marriage? The biggest question is this actually true? Like, is this the way God is, the creator has designed and intended for his creation to operate? Like, that's the ultimate question. If we're settled on that, then it would be unloving, right, to not communicate God's design for how we're supposed to flourish as humans. So that's why we want to really focus on God, the creator's design first, and then in love, in compassion and humility with authenticity to embody and communicate God's design. I think it would be unloving to do otherwise for our youth, especially like, and we do raise this question, like we do kind of throughout kind of compare, here's the secular sexual ethic and here's the Christian sexual ethic. Does it look like the secular sexual ethic is working? Are people really happy and flourishing when they loosen the boundaries on sexual expression? Like, how's that going for us, societally speaking? And it's a complicated question, but I think we need to be a little bit aware that yeah, I don't, just because it's countercultural, just because it might get you canceled or it's unpopular, I, I don't know. I mean, I think the Me Too movement and other things have kind of shown that, like, I don't know if Hollywood kind of has the corner market on the best way to understand, how to really flourish sexually speaking. So yeah.
It's all so good. And we've got a couple of just phenomenal questions that I wish we had more time to wrestle with and get your response
Yeah.
to. But we need to start closing our time down. And I want to give you the last word today before we leave. So before we do that, just take a quick breath. And what I'll say is just thank you, everyone, for being a part of this time today. And thank you, Preston, for blessing us with your giftedness to care for people well, the curriculum that you've developed. It really means a lot. And thank you to all of our live audience for submitting questions and attending this. And God bless you as you continue to work with teenagers to help them find and follow Jesus. This is a critical moment in the church. And I just want to give one quick announcement for you before we give Preston the final word today as we end our webinar. Just a little update on Embrace in general. We will be taking a little hiatus on our Embrace webinars for a few months. We're coming up with a plan to start a new, a new series coming up, maybe towards middle or end of summer. But for the next couple of months, we want to encourage you to actually go back and engage the previous 21 Embrace webinars that are available for free in our archives on our website at covchurch.org/embrace. And seeing as we're talking about youth ministry today, I would encourage you to take some time to engage some of the specific webinars that engage youth ministry. We had a fantastic conversation with Dr. Julia Sadusky a few months ago on understanding emerging gender identities, which Preston has touched on today. Even back in December, we highlighted our new youth ministry case study resource, and hopefully that can be something that you and your church could use. So again, if you go to covchurch.org/embrace, all the information on these webinars is there, and we will be posting future opportunities as they become available. And again, thank you, friends, for being a part of this. So Preston, we've got about 2.5 minutes. Could you please give us the final word of the webinar today?
Yeah. First of all, I mean, an hour is way too short for such a complex topic. I would encourage you, if you're a youth leader or parent, to check out the resource and see if it's for you. And there's obviously, theological and ethical diversity out there. Some of you may look at it and say, no, I'm not, this isn't where I'm at. So why would I show this to my youth? But for those of you who do, maybe do line up with where the ECC's at, I think it would be really helpful to go through. I just want to reiterate just the deep need to do your own research on sex, sexuality, and gender. Read a diversity of viewpoints. I am a huge fan, of promoting other people's work. Like you could read books I've written, books other people have written. Make sure you read on the other side. If you are on the more progressive side, make sure you read high quality books on the more historically Christian side of things. Like read broadly, read deeply, love widely. At the end of the day, our ultimate goal is to love God and love neighbor as ourself. And I think the best way to love people well is from the foundation of the Creator's design for sexual expression and how we're supposed to view our bodies. So I think we need to work. This is my challenge. My ultimate challenge is to really work out, fine tune your theology of and ethic of sexuality, so that when you're seeking to love God, love others well, you are doing so from a very stable, thoughtful, biblically grounded understanding of God's design for us. And it's from that perspective that we can truly love people well. We're not loving people well if we're trying to love them away from God's design. So we need to figure out what God's design is and be really confident in that. Not just because our church teaches it, not just because we signed a statement as youth leaders. We need to do the hard work of ourselves as leaders to wrestle with these important questions.
That's so good. Well, thank you, Preston. And thank you, everyone. God bless you as you care for teenagers. And thank you again, Dr. Preston Sprinkle. We really appreciate it. God bless you, friends. Have a great day.